In this tutorial, what we're going to do is take a look at adding the next set of components onto our PCB. Okay, so we're doing well so far. Hopefully, at the moment, your PCB looks something like this one I've got just here in my hand. Okay, the main thing that you'll notice is I've got my diode, that's been put in place, my 10k resistor, that's this one over here. I've got my 22k, my 100k underneath it. Make sure when you were doing this, by the way, and it's worth a check before you go too much further, that where you thought you had your 100k, which is this one here, that's the one that goes brown, black, yellow, as opposed to the 10k, which is brown, black, orange. Okay, a common mistake and one that's easily made. I've also got my 220 ohm resistors that are all put in here, and of course my diode as well, and you can see that grey band pointing upwards. Okay, so what are we going to add now? Well, we're going to try in this tutorial and add three different things. And we'll start with one of the easier ones, which is the download socket. Okay, now the download socket is this one that looks a little bit like this just here. Okay, before you do try and solder it, make sure that you've got a good one. Now a good one is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 pins along its bottom edge. You see those just there, and it's also going to have another pin just here as well, like this. What a lot of people find when their circuits don't work when they plug them in is that this pin here, this sort of one towards the top of the socket, gets kind of folded down flat and squashed out of the way as they solder it in. So if you can make sure that that doesn't happen to yours, then you've got a much better chance of getting a good result. The download socket goes in just here, so that the metal tip that I see here hangs off the end of the board. So I'm just going to pop mine in place now. Okay, I'm going to put that in, and then when you give it a gentle push, it should sort of drop, and sometimes it clicks. It can click into place. Okay, so it sits there nice and flat like so, and you can see coming at the other end of my board, I've got all those pins. There they are. They're all sticking up, all ready to be soldered in place. When you solder these, okay, as well, this is important. When you solder these two on this right hand edge just here, you'll notice they're all part of the same sort of track. So if when you solder this one and you solder this one, that the solder ends up touching, that's not a problem. Over here on this side, if you get these two, okay, these two here, and if again when you solder these two end up touching, that's not a problem either. What is a problem is if this innermost one touches the middle, or if this innermost one touches the middle. You don't want that to happen. Okay, so let's get that clamped and get that soldered in place, and again of course making sure that we've got a good old blob of solder on there as well. There's no soldering needed in these corners because those are just plastic. Okay, and this bottom part down here, that's just plastic as well. Okay, so there's no advantage in trying to solder anything onto that. So let's clamp and solder and do that now. So I'm sort of pinching it so it's just got hold of it in the corner. Do a quick visual check, make sure I've got my goggles on. I'm just making sure that all the pins are still out after I've clamped it, because sometimes you clamp it and the clamp kind of pulls the download socket out of position, but it looks to me like this one's holding in pretty good. So get soldering on a quick wipe because I haven't used it for a few minutes, and let's get this in place. So I have this in here, that's touching, count to 3, feeding a good bit of solder. You might need quite a bit to get a good connection. There you go, that one done. Next one, feeding in the solder. Next one, feeding in the solder. Okay, again my two are touching, I can see that here, but I know that's not a problem, we've already talked about that. Okay, that's that one on. So just bring a little bit more solder out. And again, I'll try to get a good connection. There you go, that's alright. And get that on there like so. Okay, so those have all been soldered. Let's just take a quick look and just make sure we're happy with those. Okay, so you can see that, like I said, would probably happen. These two here are actually soldered together, they're touching. These two here soldered together, they're touching. But again, that's not a problem, and that one at the top as well. So that's looking good. Okay, so the next component I'd like us to look at is this one here. This is called a 7805 voltage regulator. Okay, 7805 regulator. And when you hold it with the blocky part just here and the writing facing you, the legs go like this. The left hand one is input, the middle one is reference, the right hand side one is output. So what I'm actually going to do then is pick up my PCB now and take a look at it, and as I'm holding it in my hand looking kind of a lot like this, I look at the back and I'll see over on the right hand side, just above where the diode was mounted, you can see I've got 3 holes just here. Okay, you can see those 3 holes, and basically next to the topmost one, although it's not entirely in focus at the moment, you'll just see the word in. Okay, and in refers to input voltage. So I know that when I've got my 7805 that I've got here, that this pin here, this leftmost one, is the one that's going to need to go through that top hole. So I'm just going to pop that through there, kind of like that, so that when I'm done, the writing on the 7805 is facing outwards. It's facing out of the PCB. Okay, like so. So I can now pop that in here, clamp it, and get in there with a soldering iron. Now the middle one is the hardest one to do, so I'm going to do the middle one first. Okay, quick wipe. So coming in, get these goggles back on. Okay, middle one first. So get in there, count to about 3 or 4. Now you don't have to wait longer than a count of 3 or 4 on these as well, because they're slightly thicker legs on the components. The 7805 also acts as what's called a heat sink, which we'll talk about some more down the line, I'm sure. So it will take longer than about 3 seconds to get that up to temperature, so do expect that. Okay, that's my second one done. And third one. Like so. Okay, so that's the 7805 put in place. Let's get those side cutters now, give that a little trim. Okay, and that's all held in place, lovely. And what we do next, the final thing I wanted to show in this tutorial is this. Now this is the chip holder. Okay, this is what our Genie chip's going to sit in. And when you hold that, what you need to notice is that at one end there's a little notch, okay, which is just up here, okay, a little notch. Just then, you can just make that out, okay, like so. The other end doesn't have that notch, okay, but the top does. We use that to indicate when we put in the Genie chip which way up it needs to go, okay. So we will say that pin 1 is basically this pin just here. If we look on the back of our PCB, you'll see that these sort of holes here are the ones where the Genie chip's going to go, and there's actually a number 1 written. There it is, you can just see that with the light. There's a number 1 written up there, so I know that my notch needs to be facing that way. It needs to be facing the top of the board. So again, let's just pop that in. The other thing you'll find with this as well is this is a good way of knowing whether or not you're any good at drilling holes, because if you didn't drill your 8 holes for this really neatly, then it won't drop in there very well. Luckily, I'm incredibly skillful and talented, so when I drilled mine, they've gone in absolutely perfectly, and it's just sat in place like that. So I'm going to now pop this in here. Let's just see if I can clamp that down, see how cooperative it all wants to feel. That's gone on there quite nicely actually. Okay, and now I can get in there and solder that using the usual technique. What you want to do as well is after you've drilled and you've soldered your first pin, okay, I'm doing number 1 first, doesn't really matter what order you do them in, I tend to use one of the corners though. Once you've soldered your first one, what I tend to then do is remove it and just do a quick visual inspection just to make sure that the chip socket is sitting flat on the board, which in my particular case it is. It's actually sitting on there really nice and flat, so I can solder the rest of these in quite confidently. If it wasn't sitting in nice and flat, then what I want to do is to basically melt the solder on here while gripping it along those pliers just to make it sit flat, to be a bit more cooperative. When you are doing these as well, do make sure that you don't end up with one sort of the pads touching the next one, okay? This is probably the most important set of solder connections in this whole sort of operation really. So it's the one you really do want to take your time over the most when you're doing it, to make sure you don't end up with any shorts. Okay, so no one pad should touch any other. Just going to unwind and put a bit more on here. Okay. Oh, that didn't go on very well. I'm not happy with that one. Okay, got one that didn't go on too good. I'll redo that. It's sort of sticking up like a blob. I'm not sure what I did wrong there. Probably didn't leave it on for long enough before I put the solder in place. So I'll melt that solder and try and make it a bit neat. There you go, that's actually come up a bit better. Okay, so you can now see I've soldered all those in place. Okay, that's all looking quite neat and tidy. Got my voltage regulator sticking out the top, that's looking good as well. all that remains now is to do the power, which I think we can do now actually in this tutorial, so I've only been talking for 5 minutes. We're going to do the power as well. So you need to get yourself a PP3 battery clip, kind of looks a bit like this. Now we recycle a lot of these, so what you might find, like I've got with this particular one, is that you end up with just sort of bare ends like this. Okay, see I've got a black end and a red end like so. Red's positive, by the way. What I suggest you do is grab yourself a wire stripper. I've got one just here, and you'll pop that wire stripper on the end and just quickly give that a pull. Do it to the black one as well, like so, and go like that. You've now got these two bare wire ends. What you then want to do is just get those bare bits of wire in your fingers and twist them up like so, and twist them up. And what you could do, one way, is you could just solder these straight in, or you could do something else, which is to sort of make them a little bit easier to work with, which I'm going to show you how to do. I'm just going to do it to one of them, just so you can see what I'm doing. What I'm actually going to do is take the red one, and I'm going to put it here in the clamp, and I'm going to clamp that and hold that still. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to take my soldering iron, and I'm going to put that sort of behind the piece of wire, behind the stripped wire, and I'm just going to feed just a little bit, not a huge amount, of solder just over the top like that. And what that basically does by sort of tinning it like that is it just means that these bits of wire are much less likely to sort of splay out and sort of spread out everywhere. It's going to make it easier to work with, so you end up with it something like that. Now to actually solder that in place, you might remember we talked about creating this one large hole here, this strain relief hole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my nice PP3, I'm going to feed that from the back of the board out, both of the wires. Okay, let's try to do that while not concentrated properly. There you go. Send it out like that. And then once it's come through, I'm then going to send it into these two wires here. This is my plus and my minus, and then solder it in place. So I'll do the red one first, which is my plus one. Okay, you can actually see on the back of the board that there's a teeny tiny little plus just next to the strain hole. So I know that this one here is positive. So let's poke the red one through that hole, like so. And because it's going to try and spring out straight away, what I'm going to do, I'll poke the black one through while I'm here as well. But the black one is the one that I didn't tin, so it might try and be a bit problematic for me. In fact, it is. Something about the magic of electronics that's always so blinking fiddly. There we go, that's actually gone through quite nicely. And once that's gone through, I'm not going to pull it all the way through, but I'm going to pull some of it through here just to try and create a little sort of loop like this before I solder it to hold it in place for me. Okay, you see what I've got there? Look, I've got these little teeny tiny loops, but just because those loops are there, it means that these end bits that I want to solder aren't trying to run away, and I can then sort of manipulate this out of the way a bit to allow me to solder it on. So don't be scared to have a good old-fashioned electronics play around with it. There we are. And I can get in there. Soldering iron comes in. And they're quite large pads, so you'll need quite a bit of solder to fill them. There we are. Like that, and that's those two soldered in place. And once they're soldered in, you can pull the remaining slack wire through on your board. Get in there with the side cutter. And again, you know, just sort of trim those off. So that's where we are now at the end of this tutorial. We've now got the power in, we've got the voltage regulator, and we've got the actual chip socket itself. All that remains is the LEDs and the push-to-make switch to actually physically operate the die. Okay, and we'll put those in our next tutorial. So I'll see you then.